So welcome to everybody. I'm so excited to have you here. We have Dr. Orlena, who is an expert in motivating healthy eating in families, and we are going to talk today about how to support your picky eater. So the first thing I want to do, first of all, is welcome you, Dr. Orlena. Thank you so much for being here. I know you and I have talked before, and I always hear such great tips and advice from you. So I'm very grateful to have you here. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And to those of you who are here live, I know a lot of people are going to watch the recording. Those of you who are here live, you know you can always post in the chat if you have any questions. The way this is going to work is I'm going to ask a few questions just to make sure you all get information that I know you probably want. But any thoughts or questions, post in the chat. And then at the end, we should have time for those of you who are here live to be able to ask any other questions you do have. So why don't we go ahead and get started? And I would love for you, Dr. Orlena, to tell us a little bit about you, how you got to the point where you're supporting families with healthy eating, but tell us about your background and how you got here.
Well, thank you for asking. And that's actually a really interesting question. I was thinking about this earlier and looking at my children who are still picky, but we have a system that works for us, and thinking, when I was a child, this whole concept of being a picky eater and not eating certain foods just didn't really exist in my family. And so I find it a little bit strange that I have picky eaters. But essentially, I trained as a pediatric doctor in the UK. At that time, I would see a lot of parents would come to me and they would say, "Oh, my child's got tummy pain." And I, without any kids, would go, "Oh, that is fabulous news. You know why? The problem is your child isn't eating any vegetables. So easy. You don't have to take any medications. Just change your diet. It's so easy." Fast forward a few years, I had kids. I actually had 4 children under the age of 4.5. And I realized that whole getting children to eat vegetables wasn't as easy as putting the vegetables in front of them and hoping that they would eat them. And, to my shame and horror, I remember my second son, when he was 3, sitting on the toilet with just tears rolling down his face because, hey, guess what? He was constipated and he was having problems going to the bathroom. And I think it was a sort of moment for me that I realized that although I was giving him lots of vegetables or presenting him with lots of vegetables, what he was really doing was picking out all the pasta and eating the pasta. And I realized that it's not as easy as, just making sure that those healthy options are available. So parallel to that, I would say, we moved to Spain 10 years ago. And so my clinical practice, well, that's a long story, but essentially I stopped working clinically and I started working online. And so I was doing healthy eating, which it is for me, but on the other end, it's picky eating. And yeah, it was me devouring everything that I could find to work out, like, what is wrong with my children? Why don't they eat these lovely, delicious vegetables that I present them with? And so, yeah, I did a lot of research into picky eating and the information that's out there, plus the reality of experimenting on my own kids and working out what works in reality and what doesn't work.
Yes, absolutely. It's so funny when we're not parents and it seems so easy. Just put the vegetables there and they'll eat them and dinner time will be lovely and wonderful. And it just, in the real world, it just doesn't go that way.
Yeah, exactly.
So, thank you for being honest too about what goes on in your home, because I think that's really helpful for people to know that they are not alone. And this was a really popular...
We're still traveling yuck curves. If you can hear it in the background, please excuse the loud emotions that are going on in the background.
We actually can't, but I'm glad you're letting them travel the curve because that's what needs to happen. So no, I can't hear anything. I don't know about anybody else. So it is really great that you're normalizing this behavior though, because it is really common. And I will tell everyone who's here, who's watching the replay, that this was a really popular topic. You are not alone if you're going through this. And I love that you said, years ago, this didn't exist, picky eating. What was that? But a lot of parents are going through this. So let's actually do this. Can you define what you mean clinically by a picky eater? And then how common is it to have picky eaters?
Yeah, well, that's another really interesting question, actually. And picky eating is a spectrum. So, what I mean by picky eating might be very different from what other people eat. And what I meant for me was that I wasn't a picky eater. So it wasn't something in our family that existed. And I'm sure there were picky eaters, but it just wasn't a thing that we talked about. But, it might be something like my child doesn't eat mushrooms or aubergines, eggplants. They have, a few things that they don't like. It's not a big deal because we can skirt around them. But then you've got the other end of the spectrum where children are very rigid, and there's very different reasons for that. And, when you're looking at clinical extreme picky eating, the definition of that is when somebody will eat 10 things or less. But when you say 10 things, it's like carrot sticks and carrot coins and grated carrots count as 3 different things. So each pasta is a different type of thing. It's not one blanket thing. But I think the reality is the problems start arising when it starts impacting us as a family. And what I mean by that is we so often feel held hostage by our children because we want to please our children, but they then start saying things like, well, I want this and I want that. And so then we start trying to please them, and then they decide they don't like that anymore and they want something else. And we just feel backed into a corner. And I think that's when the danger starts happening, when it starts coming that we are creating foods in a different way and we're finding ourselves eating in a different way than what we want to eat. So for example, I found when my children were young that we would be eating pasta basically every single night, because pasta with vegetables, granted, but I knew that my children would eat pasta. And so I was cooking pasta and pasta and pasta until the moment that I basically realized that pasta is actually not a great food for us. That's a different topic that I'm taking you down. But I think that's the crux. When it starts impacting your family, that's when you need to do something about it.
Yeah. And I know the stress that I hear about a lot from families, and those of you who are here live, again, please comment. I have the chat open. I can see what you're typing. Is too that, they're not going to get enough vegetables. They're not going to have enough nutrients. And so, it's not just I'm changing my meals, but they're not going to be able to eat healthy. And then that's why I'm glad I'm talking to a pediatrician about this, because that is a big concern too. If they're not eating enough vegetables, then I'm not doing a good job as a parent, and all of that happens as well. So I'm sure you see that too.
Yes. Yeah. And I will talk to you about how to fix that. But yes, there becomes this sort of pressure at mealtime.
Yes.
It's the battle of the pea. You have to eat that pea because otherwise I failed as a parent and you're going to get unwell. But we will discuss that and how to fix that in a minute.
Yes. Which leads to the next question I want to ask you, which we can start pretty general. Do you have any general tips for families with picky eaters to deal with meal times, which right now may be very stressful?
Yeah, I have loads and loads of tips, but I will keep it easy. I think the first thing you need to do is take a step backwards, and you need to be objective, and you need to sort of step out of that emotional thing that we are. So, we are essentially emotional creatures who can think, as opposed to thinking creatures who also have emotions. And the problem that happens is at dinner time, a lot of things are emotionally driven. And then we try and fix these things with our brain, which is also feeling this emotion. And it's almost like you're inside this bubble and you can't get to that picture. So what you need to do is take a step back and have a look at the situation from afar. And the first thing I would say is looking at this idea of vegetables and does my child eat vegetables? I want them to grow up to eat healthily. Well, number one, you have the whole of their childhood to teach them healthy eating. If you look at the long-term picture, what we want is our children to grow up being healthy, making healthy choices by themselves. They're not going to have us, when they leave home, poking them, going, eat some peas, please. So we want to instill those healthy habits in them. And I'm all about habits and systems and routines. But when they're habits, they will just do them automatically without thinking about it. And, there's been studies that show that children essentially carry on eating the same way when they leave home and go to university. They often have a sort of, I'm going to go out and go wild and, I don't know, eat McDonald's or whatever. And then in the second term, they go back to cooking the way their families cook, which really leads me on to the second point, which is it's not about one meal. It's about everything that you are presenting your child. And so not only do you have to look at the entire day of food that they're being offered, you have to look at everything in the week. So, you know, if they are eating at school, or if they're eating at friends, or if they're eating out, all of that has to be taken into consideration. And a little bit of hard love. A lot of people think that their diet is relatively healthy, but the vast majority of people, there's a lot of room for improvement. And I'm just going to cover nutrition by saying, add more vegetables, because if you just eat more vegetables, you will naturally increase the amount of vegetables and decrease the amount of, you know, other stuff that you're eating. So packaged foods. And once you start looking at, okay, I'm going to present healthy foods all day, and you know your children are eating all day, suddenly that takes the pressure off dinner time, because you're no longer worried about that 1p. It doesn't matter, because you know they've eaten some carrot sticks and an apple at lunchtime. So there's no pressure on it. And when we think about, okay, how am I going to present food? How am I going to turn up at that mealtime? What we want to be thinking is, we're presenting the foods and our children are in charge of what they eat. Now, I don't mean they get to eat cake the whole time, but what I do mean is we don't pressure them to eat. We're not pushing them to eat foods that they dislike. It's an invitation. Now, I would say on top of that, we need to be aware of portion sizes, because portion sizes is another big topic. And I think it's really important to think about foods that are easy to eat. So in that, I include desserts and treats and sweets, but also there are easy to eat savory foods. We have spaghetti bolognese here. I think the American equivalent is mac and cheese, but you know, those kind of foods that we kind of breathe a sigh of relief about, because we're like, oh, great, it's spaghetti bolognese tonight. I know my child's gonna eat that really easily. There's not going to be any fuss. And we end up giving them a double portion because they're enjoying it. And then we're feeling, oh, I'm fulfilling this role of feeding my child. But really and truly, our role is to offer food. When we think, okay, what's the purpose of eating? The purpose of eating is to fuel our bodies and not for enjoyment. And we sometimes get that, we quite often get that a little bit muddled up. And when we can think, okay, are you genuinely hungry? Have you had enough to eat? The test is always, will you eat something that's not hugely desirable? Well, if not, then you're no longer hungry. I'll give you an example. It's my son's 13th birthday today. So he made a chocolate cake himself because he doesn't trust me to make a healthier cake. So this beautiful chocolate cake, and we had chocolate cake for dinner, which essentially in the summer, we don't eat much at dinner time because it's so hot here. We have a bigger lunch. And so we had this as dinner, and I thought my kids would love this because they would be like, oh, chocolate cake for dinner, isn't that amazing? But then after the chocolate cake, they're a bit like, but I'm still hungry. And I'm like, okay, well, if you want, we've got carrots and cucumber and things like that. You can have that. And they're like, oh no, we want more chocolate cake. No, the chocolate cake, we're going to save the rest of the chocolate cake for tomorrow. My daughter's like, oh, well, we've got some like ginger, which is a bit like sweets. We could have some of that. And it's like, no, you can eat something proper if you're genuinely hungry. She did actually have some leftover lentils that we had. So she obviously was hungry and did want to eat a little bit more, but the others didn't. So in summary, what I would say is don't pressure your kids. Don't enter that fight of you have to eat that thing, but really look at the big picture of what am I serving my child and how am I presenting that food to my children.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you so much. And I know when I was actually working as a therapist, I was working in a practice that specialized in eating disorders. So I did that for about 5 years. And I was working specifically, my biggest audience was teenage girls with eating disorders. And one of the things that we talked so much about was we want kids to have a healthy relationship with food. And as soon as we start to control it, their relationship with food becomes unhealthy. And we triangulate that relationship. It's the food and then us. And so we talked a lot about this. I won't go too much into that unless anyone has any questions. But yeah, ultimately we want them to have a healthy relationship with food, and pressure is not, or controlling it is not ideal. So there's a question from Elizabeth, which ties into my next question for you. So I'm gonna ask what I wanted to and include her question as well. So I was gonna ask you, what should you do if a child refuses to eat what you've made? So you said, put the vegetables in front of them, just have them out. But what if they refuse? And then Elizabeth said, how much pressure is reasonable? My child is almost an extreme picky eater with large and emotional reactions. He's almost 6. If he doesn't eat, that exemplifies his emotions and undesirable, so probably exacerbates his emotions and undesirable behavior. So what do we do? Do we put pressure on them if they don't eat? What do we do?
No, well, I think that's a really interesting question. And so to take this a step further, what I recommend people do, especially if you have a picky eater, is you take every single food substance that they have and you make.
Okay, all set? Okay.
Sorry, I'm going to see if I can read everybody.
150.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problems. So I actually have a handout for this, which I can give to you to use, but it's called the accepted list. And you make a list of foods. So you put everything that's accepted in one list, and then you put what I call their disgusting list. And so that's everything that they have a really big disgust reaction to. And that disgust reaction may be a real disgust reaction. So for example, my oldest son, he doesn't like fish. He, unfortunately, when he was little, he used to like fish. And then one day, unfortunately, he ate lots of very pink plums and some mackerel and unfortunately vomited. And so since that day, he has never been able to touch fish. Sometimes it is more a thought thing in that, I don't know, some poor vegetables, they just don't get liked. So mushrooms is an example for this. I've actually seen my children eat mushrooms without them realizing it. And it was neither a texture or a flavor thing that really upset them. But when they know that there's mushrooms in something, they're like, oh, I don't like mushrooms. So those things go in the disgusted list. And everything else goes in the middle. And normally what children say is, I don't like it, I don't want it. And often what they mean is, I don't really know it, I'm not familiar with it, I'm scared of it, so I'm going to just say I don't like it. And what we want to do is every time we present them with food, we include something that is acceptable to them. It's not like we're trying to starve them, but what we don't want to be doing is including their favorite foods. So, you know, if you put out cake, obviously they're going to eat cake. But you need to have some safe foods that are, you know, okay. So for my picky eater, he has green apples, he has garbanzo beans and chickpeas. And so I sometimes just put those out so that he has something to eat. And, you know, if you've got a really picky eater, my children don't like it when foodstuffs touch themselves. So for example, you know, think of a Greek salad, which has got tomatoes and cucumber and olives and lettuce. They wouldn't like that because all the foods sort of come into contact with each other. But so if I put it out in little plates, like a dissected one, then they will pick what they want. So they might have some cucumber, they might have some tomato, they might have some lettuce. And doing that is a really helpful way to make all the foods our foods. Now, in reality, sometimes I put out foods which I know myself and my husband are going to eat and none of my children are going to touch. But it's not like I've made this division of this is my food and that is your food, adult and children's food. Everything is put in the middle and we can all help ourselves to it. And within that system, I can also include, oh, look, there's some chickpeas, which you can eat. If you're hungry, you can eat them. And so once we take that pressure off and know that there is something that our children can eat if they are genuinely hungry, then that's okay. And if they choose not to eat, then that's okay as well. And I think this is a really difficult situation to be in because we start now running forwards and going, well, if my child isn't going to eat, then they're going to be really, really grumpy and they're going to have big emotions and I'm going to have to deal with those big emotions. But essentially, you just have to think about, okay, what can I control? What can I do? How can I just be that person who is going to stand there in all of this big emotions, because they're going to give you big emotions anyhow. And how am I going to act? And, you know, that's where Rachel comes in and explains to us what we need to do when our children are screaming and shouting. But essentially, remember that we have fulfilled our obligation, which is to provide them with acceptable food.
So you're basically saying put out on the table acceptable foods and other foods and let them choose.
Yes, exactly. And, you know, I would go a step further as well. So thinking about our lunchtime, we all come home for lunch here in Spain, and my children are definitely carb junkies. So they love their breads, their pasta, whatever it is. For picky eaters, I also recommend that what you want to be doing is, if they really love carbohydrates, most children like carbohydrates, instead of getting into that routine of constantly having the same slice of bread or the same pasta, you want to gradually increase it. So you're sort of pushing the boundaries of what is acceptable. You're making that acceptable list bigger and bigger by going for things that are similar. So you might have what we call rivitas, like little crisp breads or breadsticks. They all fill that holding space of what I call white refined carbohydrate, but they get used to having different ones. The problem with those is you have to be aware that if you put out loads, your children will just eat loads. If I put out bread and protein, my children will eat bread and protein, and they won't eat any of the vegetables. So essentially, I put out a small portion of bread, an acceptable portion of bread, which is appropriate to their age, and they can eat their bread, they can eat some protein, and then they have free reins of the fruit and the vegetables. They can eat as much fruit and vegetable as they want. And often I put out the carrot sticks, which I know they will eat. I put those out first so they can start eating the carrot sticks. And then, the bread will come out a little bit later. But essentially, the bottom line is, unless you have an extreme picky eater, with extreme picky eaters, essentially you need to be working with a professional. But if you've got what I call a regular picky eater, your children will get used to vegetables. The reality is there are so many vegetables that there are some vegetables that you can find. The other reality is, for a lot of people who say, this is another bit of hard love, my children won't eat any vegetables, it's because they aren't being presented with enough vegetables and they're being presented with more packaged foods. And the problem with packaged foods is they don't compare to vegetables. They have so much sugar and salt that they're sort of like electricity for our taste buds. Whereas when you take away that sugar and salt, the fruit and vegetables taste amazing. So it's a whole, you have to change everything. And that may sound very scary and very intimidating, but it's fabulous. It's fabulous for families.
It can be slowly taking things away. So far, what I've definitely heard you say is we have to step back, see the big picture, and realize they are, it's not just that meal. And that in the meals, we can present foods that are appropriate portion sizes and then present the other fruit and give them other fruits and vegetables as an option. And when they are still hungry, they'll eat the fruits and vegetables, but not to pressure them necessarily to do so. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, coming back to fruit and vegetables, and I'm slightly vegetable, manic, and I think it's because people don't get this message. Healthy eating is about fruit and vegetables. We should be getting about 50% of our calories from fruit and vegetables, or 50% of what we eat should be fruit or vegetables. So that's for every 2 bites we take, one of them should be fruit and vegetables. And a lot of people aren't eating that much, but once you are eating that much, then suddenly it's just easy.
Okay, good. Okay. So I know, Kate, you asked some questions. I'm going to actually hold those till the end. I just have a couple more, and then we will definitely get to these because they're really good ones as well. Okay, so we sort of covered this, but I'm going to ask you directly anyway. Should you, and if so, how, should you encourage picky eaters to eat certain foods? And if so, how? So you kind of touched on this, but how would you get to that?
Okay, so the answer is, if you have a picky eater, the answer is no, you shouldn't. Now, there is a caveat to that, and it comes down to knowing your child. You know what your child is like. So when I look at my children, I have got 4, and 2 of them are very picky. And just to a lot of children who are picky are also very anxious. And I think that ties in. And I've got twins who are now 8, and he is my most picky eater. His twin is a very adventurous eater. However, she can see what is going on at the table, and she can see, quite often my son I'll say, you can go and get an apple if he wants an apple. I don't mind him eating apples. She will try and do the same thing because she wants to be treated in the same way. And she can just see this dynamic going in. But I know that I can say to her, you need to have some vegetables, and she will be fine. Now, I'm not directly pressuring her, and I'm not asking her to eat a food that she doesn't like. I'm asking her to eat some foods that she does like. So there is a certain amount of knowing your child. But essentially, the danger with picky eaters is if you start pressurizing them and pushing them, then you end up with this battle and you just make it worse. However, you can invite you can get on board with them and say, okay, so, well, what do you want to eat? I think giving children choices can be a little bit difficult in that sometimes we give them too many choices and then they're overwhelmed with choices. So getting that balance right of, okay, allowing them to feel in control and not overwhelming them with choices is something that you kind of have to work out. But knowing what food types they like can help, and knowing that there's something there that they can eat. But what you don't want to do is go, okay, well, you're not going to eat anything. Yeah, you can have a slice of cake. That's fine. It's about being able to go with confidence and go, okay, here's some food that's acceptable for you. You may eat it. Okay, you're only going to eat the bread. That's fine, but there's no more bread. You don't get more bread because you're refusing to eat all the fruit and vegetables.
That's a big takeaway I'm hearing from you, is put out a little bit of their sort of foods that they enjoy, the approved foods that they approve of. And then if they're still hungry, then there are fruits and vegetables for them to eat.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I would say we hugely overestimate the portion sizes that children need. And this is dangerous for two reasons. Well, it's dangerous in a number of reasons, but the danger is we overestimate all those easy foods. So the spaghetti bolognese, the ice cream, the cake, and we give our children really big portions of those things. And then they're like, well, I don't need any more calories. And I remember doing this, when I had my oldest child, when he was 1, we would go to a British coffee afternoon and have tea, and there were biscuits. And he got used to the habit that he could just go and help himself to all of these biscuits. And when it was dinner time, he's like, well, I clearly don't need to eat anything. Why would I have this stuff when I can just eat? Sorry, you guys call them cookies. I call them biscuits. But so there's that danger. But the other danger is we then think, okay, well, now I need to get my child to eat more, whether it's healthy foods or just sort of maintenance foods. But actually, they've eaten enough. The bottom line is, if your child is growing healthily and your pediatrician is happy with them growing, they're getting enough. That's the definition of enough calories. They're getting enough. So unless your child has an issue with growing, then they are getting enough to eat. Yeah,
absolutely. I see a lot of questions coming in, so I want to wrap up our report because I do have one more for you that I want to ask you, and then I want to get everybody else's questions in. But what I will say is you used a couple of words in there that I think are super important when it comes to eating, and that was anxiety and confidence. And very honestly, so much about eating is related to anxiety, both your kids' anxiety, often, and you can speak to this a little bit if you want to, but they have sensory issues. So some things feel weird in their mouth, and then it creates some anxiety, and that's why they're so resistant. We all know that one of the coping mechanisms for anxiety is resistance. And then the opposite of anxiety, many of my members have heard me say this, many of the parents I work with, the opposite of anxiety is I can handle anything. That is the opposite of anxiety. So that's where confidence comes in. So because there's so much related to eating, related to anxiety and confidence, my last question for you is, how do you think we can help parents feel more in control and less stressed? Because that's going to make everything better. Do you have any tips on that?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it comes to structure. I am all about systems, habits, and routines. And it's not because I'm this organized person. I definitely didn't used to be a really organized person. It's come from realizing that once we have a structure, life just happens easily. So I think it's just about habits of knowing, okay, this is what we're providing. And obviously it doesn't have to be the same foods, but it's healthy foods. And healthy foods are so easy. I think a lot of people have fear of healthy foods. They think, oh, it has to be complicated. It doesn't have to be complicated. I literally take some peppers and throw them in the oven, and that's easy. It's easy to do. Obviously, my children don't eat those peppers, I'll grant you, but there are, they will in a few years' time, they will get to eat them. But if we have this structure and we know that we are doing our role, our responsibility, then we can just stand there and go, okay, I know that my responsibility is done. It's over to you. And then the rest of that is self-awareness. That's, the work that you do on being self-aware of our own emotions and how the emotions ricochet off each other. When you have a screaming child, it's really difficult to stand there and not get affected by that screaming. That's hard work. But self-awareness will help you do that. And gradually, you'll get to that place where your system works. Yeah, it's not perfect. It's not like my children don't ever scream. I don't know what's wrong with my children, but they're all screaming at the moment or crying. But that happens. And it's having that confidence to go, okay, that happens. That's normal life, but we can cope with it. And I can cope with it.
Absolutely. And I love that you said the systems and habits and routines, because that's one of the things I emphasize too. It is so hard in the moment to deal with all of this. But when you create a system, when you say, okay, and I just talked about the parenting avatar in my academy, so everyone knows what I mean by that, hopefully. When we have an avatar and we say, this is how I want meal time to go, especially based on the tips that you just gave, this is what it's going to look like. And you just keep doing the same routine over and over, and you don't get sucked into yuck in the moment. Kids do come to learn what to expect. So I think that's really, really good advice. I talk about routines all the time. That's really the solution. It's such an underused discipline strategy, but it really helps. So I do want to get into the people's questions, because there's some really good ones here. So first is, my kids will love something one week and then change their minds the following week. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there are two reasons why this happens. One is the disgust reaction that we talked about. So it might be that, something happens, you might vomit, you've got a specific reason for developing that disgust reaction. And if that happens, it may be that you never gain that, particularly if you don't help your child go through that thought process that's going, and, emotional process, which can be difficult to do. Most times it is just a sort of fatigue effect of, oh my goodness, I have had that a little bit too often. We often have our safe foods, which we know our children will eat, and we get to rely on them a little bit too often, and then our kids get a bit fed up of them. If that happens, just step back and say, okay, I'm going to put this away for a bit, and try it again in a week or 2 weeks and see if they come back. So they should, after a period of time, come back, but don't push it.
Yeah, that was simple. Good, thank you. Do you recommend giving dessert even if they don't eat dinner?
Well, that is another interesting conversation, and that depends on whether you're talking about healthy eating or picky eating. So I would say that you don't need to give dessert every single day. And when I first had kids, for some reason, I used to give dessert every single day. I don't know why I used to do this. I look back and just think I had this idea that children needed dessert. And so when I started introducing solids to my child, he would always have a dessert. And I got to the stage where I realized that my children were just doing that thing where they hold off. I'm not eating any of the main course because I know there's going to be a dessert. And I went one day, okay, we're not having dessert. We're changing the system. We're only going to have dessert on Friday and Saturday. And because I went into it with a very confident, this is what's happening, actually, there was no fuss, and we got into this routine very, very easily. And I would say as well, you can have healthy desserts. So desserts can be, cooked apple, and they don't have to include sugar and honey and sweetener. It can just be fruit is dessert. So basically, if dessert is on the menu, then the answer is no. You can serve it when you want. If you want to, you could serve dessert at the same time as main course. The point being that if you're saying it's okay to eat those calories, it's okay to eat those calories. Now, I don't teach calories, but let's say energy, that food. So, you're thinking about everything that you're feeding your child. So if you're saying it's okay for them to have that treat, then it's okay for them to have that treat. And I would also say, thinking about recommendations, one thing we haven't really talked about is limits. Which is another really important thing to talk about, limits and emotions, and not creating that connection of emotions with food. So don't modify your children's behavior with food. So what I mean by that is don't punish them, oh, you can't have dessert unless you behave nicely. Or one that I used to do before I became aware of it was when my child was young and he didn't want to get his car seat on, I would offer him a biscuit, a cookie, and suddenly it was so much easier. But what I'm doing is distracting him with some food. So the other side of that is limits. And, where we want to teach our children is to have this internal limit, which is, oh, when I go to a birthday party, I have a slice of cake. And on special occasions, I might have 2, but it's not 5 or 6 slices of cake. And children need to learn that for themselves. And they learn it slightly from habit, but they also learn it from, that's kind of our routine. So I would say you want to have a look at the sweets the sweet things that you're giving your children and say, okay, this is our family limit and we stick to this. And, one limit that is recommended by the Infant Toddler Forum, which is run by the hospital in London called Great Ormond Street. They recommend one sort of sweet thing a day, which might be a cookie, it might be breakfast cereal, but something that contains refined sugar. And then once a week, something, like candy. But those are recommendations, but you have your own internal limits and you need to consider desserts in that as well.
Great.
Did that answer your question in a very long way?
One of the things I think, so the question was, do you recommend giving dessert even if they don't eat dinner? And one of the things I took out of that was you sort of have to decide ahead of time what you're comfortable with. You could say dessert is only on Fridays. You decide ahead of time, make a rule and then follow that rule. It almost sounds like that's what you were saying.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the bottom line is we don't eat desserts for their nutritional value. If we're going to say to our children, oh, you can have an ice cream because it's a treat, it's summer here, we sometimes go and get a beautiful ice cream. We're not eating that ice cream because we need that nutrition. We're eating that ice cream because it's a pleasurable thing to do. And really and truly, the same thing is true of desserts. It's not for nutritional value. It's because that we eat those things for enjoyment.
Yeah. So if they don't eat, I just want to make sure her question does get answered. If they don't eat dinner, should they get dessert?
Yes.
Okay.
But a reasonable portion of dessert as well.
Okay.
So, thinking it's a reasonable portion and not a giant portion of dessert.
Okay.
So there's a lady called Ellen Satter who has done a lot of work. Yeah. And one of the things she says is that children can have seconds, and I would say seconds of fruit and vegetables, but she recommends just one portion of dessert so that you get that limit, that, that's just a habit that I have in life. There's one portion of dessert.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. All right, next question. My daughter used to be a very healthy eater, but her list of foods has dwindled to under 10 over the past year. She will try new foods, but she just doesn't have a taste for a lot of foods, which results in what I would call food fatigue. And then she doesn't want to eat anything. And if we don't prompt her on how necessary it is to fuel up, she won't bother to feed her hunger. I hear the advice not to pressure your child to eat, but how do you prompt your child to eat in a healthy way?
Well, to be honest, if she's eating less than 10, I would go and get her checked out, make sure she's okay. And the big question is she growing? So, you need to go to your pediatric doctor and to make sure she is growing. It is human. It's one of the sort of human instincts to get food and fuel. And the big question is, what happens if you don't ever pressurize her, don't ever prompt her? At some stage, she should come and say, I'm hungry. I need some food to grow myself. And if that's not happening, then, you need some additional help. But I think people are often scared to say, okay, what does happen if I do this? That, if I let go and I don't prompt her in any way whatsoever. But, if you've got this structure of, let's say, for example, it's breakfast, snack, lunch, dinner. If you've got that structure, what you're saying is, here is an eating opportunity. Here's some food. If you don't take that eating opportunity, that's fine, but there's no more food until the next eating opportunity. And once you're in that system, and it may take a while to train your children, but then they just know, okay, I can eat at breakfast, I can have a snack, I can eat at lunch, and I can eat at dinner time. And if I skip my lunch, then I have to wait for dinner. And as a society, we have this huge fear of hunger, which is, it's partly for adults as well, but it's a really interesting thing. And the question is, what happens when you get hungry? And the answer is actually nothing. Nothing happens to your body. Your body goes and it digs out some of its own energy. We have loads of stores of energy in our body, and our body goes, oh, I've got to go and get some energy. But from society's point of view, we've got so used to having our energy always from an external source, because that's what happens in society now. It's so easy to go and get food that we just think we have to get food. We have to have an external source of energy. But that's not how our bodies are supposed to work. Our bodies are supposed to work by we eat food, we store some food, and then we use that energy. But now, and this is, fueling the obesity epidemic that we're seeing, people eat and then they store, and then they eat some more, and then they store, and they eat some more, and they store, and they forget about this whole bit, which is, oh, it's fine to let my body not eat for a while because I can use the energy that I have inside myself. And so once you can let go of that and go, okay, my child is going to be fine if they miss lunch, as long as they're growing, it's fine. They've got some energy. Even children have energy. Thin people have something like 3 months worth of energy on them. So there's, and people who have more weight on them, they have even longer. So, we are okay in terms of energy. It's not like oxygen. It's not like if there's no oxygen, we keel over.
Yeah, gotcha. And I think what you're saying is a prompting could be the routine. The prompts, the healthy prompts could be, this is when we're eating, this is what is served. And that could be more of a healthy prompt than the pressure. Yeah,
it's just routine. So it's an invitation. If you want it, have it. And if you don't want it, and this is where we have to do that internal work because it's very difficult. We're trained to feed our children. And again, that's because we come from, this scarcity where, food wasn't available. So we're trained to say, children, you have to eat your food because we don't know when the next meal is going to be coming, but we always do know when the next meal is going to be coming. So it's just an invitation. Here you go, eat your food or don't, it doesn't matter. But when our children say, I don't want to, we have all kinds of stuff going on inside of us. And it's really difficult to just go, okay, that's fine.
I think that's a really big key, what you just said. Eat or don't, it doesn't matter. That's what we need to feel. And if anyone's struggling with this, I would say reach out to me too, because a lot of this and a lot of food, and we're not going to be surprised, is us. It's our worry and our concern. So eat or don't, it doesn't matter. I'm okay with it either way. I'm presenting you with this food in a routine that I've decided makes sense for our family. There was a follow-up to that question. When you invite them to the table, should you require them to sit at the table even if they don't eat?
Yes, I think so. I mean, this is sort of like, it's open to your family rules, but I also I think that you want children to be, particularly if you have picky eaters, you want them to be there sort of helping you prepare the meal, which is good for so many things. Partly it's good because it shows children what goes into a meal and how much work we do to create this food that they can't be bothered to eat or don't want to eat. But also it's mentally preparing people that there is going to be a meal time. And if you have a picky eater as well, it can set the tone for them, because often that anxiety is, oh, I come to the table and suddenly I've got this thing and I don't like it and it takes me a bit of time to get used to it. So if you've got a picky eater, one thing you can do is think about that routine before dinner time and perhaps get them to lay the table and to, I don't know, come and taste the food and see if they like it and help in whatever way they can. Another thing I find useful having 4 children who are very noisy is to start the meal just being quiet and just going, okay, let's calm down for a little bit and all start together and say thank you for our food and, then move on. And obviously, if you've got a picky eater who's screaming, that can take a little bit of time, but I recommend waiting. I mean, it depends how long it's going to take, but waiting for them. And the other thing I always say as well is I like my children at the end of the meal to say, thank you, and may I get down? And I think that's a signal to say, particularly for young children, to say, okay, we've had this mealtime, we've all been together. If you don't want to eat the food, that's fine, but I would like you to turn up in a polite way. And now we finished the meal. And, I noticed that my daughter, when she was younger, when she was like 2 or 3, she would want to get up and get down and get up and get down and come back and eat a little bit more. And it's like, no, you've left the table. Now stop eating, please. Sit and eat. And so this is like a reflection of mindful eating as adults do. And when you have finished eating, stop eating and go and do something else. And that's perfectly fine. And ideally, you want your children to help you clear up as well. Pack the dishwasher, do the dishes, do something else so that, you're working as a team. And to be perfectly honest, it takes time and it takes training children. It's not like, I've got this great idea, you can all do the work tomorrow. It's a process that they have to go through. And I always have this saying with my children, when they start complaining about their jobs, I'm like, oh, you need more jobs because you're not used to this.
So we have two more questions. I'm going to use these to wrap up. I do want to just say one thing to piggyback on, though, a tip that I often cook. I'm not a big cook, but I cook with my kids. And one of the things I do is I actually put vegetables out while we're cooking, and they're hungry at that point and they are eating vegetables and they're not even noticing they're doing it. So it's just something we happen to do,
Yeah, it's
going
fabulous.
along with the cooking together. But let me wrap up with the last two questions. Should dessert be treated as a reward? If my kids at least try everything on their plate, not foods on their discuss list, I'll let them have a sweet. Is that setting a negative pattern?
Yeah, sorry, it is. What you're essentially doing there is you are rewarding their behavior with food. So, you know, we want to take away all emotions around food. Foods is about eating. The purpose of eating is to fuel our body. And do you know what? It doesn't matter if your child eats. I mean, I know we want our children to eat a healthy and varied diet, but if they eat, you know, carrots and apples every single day, as long as they're getting the nutrients they need, that's probably not a great example, but that's okay. So we want to take away all emotions, and we definitely don't want to be signaling that, oh my goodness, the main course is something that we have to sort of, you know, sit through, we have to tolerate so that we can get to this treat, which is dessert, which is amazing and lovely. No, all of it is just to fuel our body. And I know I said that dessert is that we don't eat it for fuel. We don't really. The reality is we don't need that, but it should be included in those calories. What you want in a healthy diet is that those desserts are, you know, the part of what makes up the calories that your body actually needs, as opposed to those calories which we're going to store. But the message we want to give to our kids is all of it is about nutrition and fuel as opposed to enjoyment. So yeah, essentially what you're doing is making a connection. You're rewarding their behavior with food. And if you want to reward behavior, not at the meal time, but, you know, you want to be rewarding it with other things, which Rachel will tell you about, you know, like warmth and connection and things like that, as opposed to food.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things hopefully taking away too today is decide ahead of time when the dessert will be, and not make it, if you do this, then you get dessert. This is when we're having dessert as, you know, a sweet treat, and it's not based on what you do. So it's not the reward. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing I would say as well is I make sure that I have healthy desserts as well. So like if I know that my children, I'm going to do a meal like fish where none of my kids are going to basically eat anything, I'll do an apple crumble for dinner and I'll put very, very little sugar in it. But it's essentially a healthy meal. It's full of apples. And yeah, it's got a little bit more sugar in it than if it was just vegetables. But actually, nutritionally, it's not that bad. And that's perfectly fine. We sometimes have dessert for dinner because like, we often get into this habit of going, okay, I'm going to eat all the calories I need in my dinner, and then I'm going to eat some extra ones, which are dessert. But you could just say, well, I'm going to eat dessert, and that's going to be the calories that my body needs.
Gotcha. All right, last question. I worry my kids don't get enough protein. Where does protein fall in priority with fruits and vegetables?
Okay, so protein is, you know, we do need protein. And adults need protein. Protein is a slightly controversial topic. Of course, children need protein, but the reality is in the standard American diet is people have far, far, far more protein than they need. And most children get enough protein. So I suspect you need to go and have a look. And I will give Rachel a link to some portion sizes that is run by the Infant Toddler Forum, and it will show you the portion sizes that you need. The reality is I suspect your child is getting enough protein. Now, obviously, without looking at your child and what they're eating, I can't promise you that. But so we don't actually need that much protein. And if we're talking healthy eating, plant proteins are far better for you than animal proteins. Sorry, it's windy here and the door keeps slamming. So yeah, they do need a little bit of protein. Most children will eat protein. So protein is eggs, cheese, meat, fish, and then lots of plant-based things, which are the better, healthier ones. So lentils and legumes like chickpeas and garbanzo beans. And there's even protein in things like rice. So, you know, we're finding protein all over the place. And there used to be this thought. So there are some proteins called complete proteins. Proteins are made up of amino acids, and the complete proteins have all the amino acids that our bodies can't make. And there used to be this thought that in order to get all of those amino acids, you have to eat them all in one food. So something like meat and eggs and cheese, they are complete proteins. Now, things like rice and beans, rice isn't a complete protein because it only has some of them. But actually now we're seeing you don't have to do that. If you eat rice in the morning and then some, peas, some lentil things in the afternoon, you've actually got all of your complete proteins. You don't have to eat them all in the same plate.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. So yeah, with that resource on appropriate portion sizes would be really, really helpful. So I think we got everyone's questions, and hopefully people have, at least a takeaway or two. Big key is to reduce your anxiety, to not put pressure, to do, for my language, change your story about how you see food, make routines ahead of time based on your values, not your fear, and then follow through with a routine. Don't pressure them. So if anyone obviously needs help with that, reach out to me. But Dr. Orlena, you have given us so much good advice. Thank you. I appreciate it. And I would love for you to share, if people want more from you, where can they find you?
Well, thank you. And I love that saying, make your routines based on your values and not your fears. I love that. Yes, that's fabulous. Thank you for asking. So I have a podcast, which is Fit and Fabulous at 40 and Beyond. It's mostly about adult health and healthy eating and working on ourselves as opposed to children. But I'm always happy to answer questions about them. I do have a website called Snotty Noses, actually, which has got most of my children's stuff on it. But, it was done a few years ago. But that's where most of my work of healthy eating for kids is housed.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for those of you who are live and have watched this far, if you're watching the recording, for being here. I, again, hope you got a couple helpful tips or two. I certainly did as well. And we will be back again soon with some more guest experts. But thank you so much for your time, Dr. Orlena. I really appreciate it. Take care.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.